first time they realized the Russians were coming was one infantryman was walking with his radio turned up to max, and they could even hear over the radio his commander giving him directions: go left, go right, go forward. And they used that to their advantage. Rus and his colleagues also had a Russian radio as well, so they could listen in to some intercepted communications and get some ideas of where to ambush them from. And the Russians kept trying to get across the same route as well. They kept using the same routes because there were these choke points at these two footbridges. And that really, really helped the Ukrainians, I think.
What I thought was really interesting also was the insight into the way that the troops on the ground are being directed from the drones, the drone operators. How precise is that direction they're getting?
We've seen that time and time again. It's really important for the war now, if you're an infantryman, to know that you have a backup of somebody above who's watching all angles where you might be attacked from, seeing and helping you, guiding you left and right. The Russians are doing it as well as the Ukrainians. It depends on, some people might do it more effectively than others. I think the Ukrainians that we spoke to were very careful about making sure their radio communications were quiet and they weren't hurt by the Russians, but the Russians were doing it rather more clumsily and more openly. But it's a huge part of the war now. We've heard tank drivers, tank gunners, all being guided from above by drone as they go into battle and search for targets.
And one of the details you also wrote about was how one of the Russians gave away their position because of their clumsiness with their radio communications.
That's right. The first time they realized the Russians were coming was one infantryman was walking with his radio turned up to max, and they could even hear over the radio his commander giving him directions: go left, go right, go forward. And they used that to their advantage. Rus and his colleagues also had a Russian radio as well, so they could listen in to some intercepted communications and get some ideas of where to ambush them from. And the Russians kept trying to get across the same route as well. They kept using the same routes because there were these choke points at these two footbridges. And that really, really helped the Ukrainians, I think.
What will happen to Rus now?
He's had a little bit of a period of rest, which is in a command post like we met him in. It's still quite intensive fighting around there. You're being bombed quite regularly with Russian glide bombs. You can hear drones overhead. Even FPV drones we could hear above us when we were there. So it's not much of a rest, but it's not as intensive as being in that frontline position. And then when he's called upon, he'll go back into a situation like that and continue fighting. And in fact, when we were in that command center, we saw how they were guiding another reconnaissance company soldier in a similar position. And we asked, what's he doing? Where's he? And they said, oh, he's there. He's surrounded. And we asked, what's he doing there? And if he's surrounded, you're not going to pull him out. And they said, no, he's just killing Russians. That's their job.
He's just going to stay there.
He's just there for the time being, yeah.
So there's virtually no time for someone like the soldier you met, like Rus, to actually process anything that's happened. What did he tell you when he had that brief respite, though, about how he saw his contribution to the war?
Yeah, I think there's a reluctance to think too deeply amongst some of these soldiers about what they've been through, and because they have to go back into it again, and that's often the difference between a motivated soldier and a soldier that can do this again and again, and a soldier that goes AWOL perhaps. And he was really nonchalant. He said, "I'm just doing my job. Everyone around me was doing it really efficiently. I'm no different. I shouldn't be awarded this medal any more than any of my colleagues should be." And he's very matter of fact, and it's quite a difficult interview at times because he doesn't feel the need to describe any heroics or anything he did. You really have to pry it out of them and then get some more detail from the company commander and some of the other officers who've been watching over him, because they were incredulous about what he'd been able to do.
Be interesting to know if he ever gets to read your report, Maxim, see what his reaction is to it. You also write about the work of Scala, the 425th Separate Assault Regiment. How did they fit into operations there?
So they're an offensive unit. They're storming positions that the Russians have taken in order to try and reclaim them for the Ukrainians. And they really, really have been key to this counteroffensive that we talked about last time, and encircling these three groups of Russians near Dobropilya. They have accepted very difficult, dangerous missions. They've won plaudits for achieving successes where others haven't, but they've also had some severe criticism for accepting pretty heavy losses in doing that. They're quite different from some of the other assault units that we've met. There's a lot of mobilized men in Scala. There's some convicts in Scala, and different motivations from fighting from some of the nationalist brigades that we've worked with. and they are fighting in pretty similarly difficult conditions. We were watching room to room fighting in a coal mine administrative building in a village outside Покrovsk. And we spoke to a soldier that had come out of one of those situations. He'd been there 40 days, so almost as long as Rus, and his face was blackened. He'd been injured by shrapnel, and then one of his colleagues had died as they'd been pulled out. And it's very, very close quarters infantry fighting in some of those big buildings and some of those villages.
And tell me about the motorcycle raids. How are they conducted?
So this is a tactic that we've seen used first by the Russians, actually, but used quite clumsily, in just sending motorbikes straight across fields, hoping that their speed will give them some advantage and get them to take some territory. And although we've seen like a lot of videos of these guys being killed, they have had some successes. And the Ukrainians thought, well, why don't we try using some motorbikes as well, but we'll use it in a kind of more careful manner. We'll use it for evacuating wounded, logistics, getting through minefields that are difficult to pass, but not in kind of plain sight. We wanted to try and attack using, more often in the darkness. They're trying to be more clever about how they use these motorbikes. And we met with the motorcycle company as they were preparing for their next assault. It's really quite daring stuff. You kind of ride up to an enemy position at 100 kilometers an hour, skid the bike down onto its side, and then it's like a few of you going forward together and trying to attack a position before the Russians realize you're coming. And essentially, mobility and surprise is the key with these motorbikes.
Max, and as you said, using the motorbikes was first known to be a tactic being used by the Russians, and it was often derided as something that was done as an act of desperation. How have the Ukrainians finessed this into something that's more effective?
So they say instead of using like motorbikes just going across on the same route, a big group of them at the same time where they could be easily hit with grenades or FPV drones, the Ukrainians spread them out. They use them on kind of 6 different routes at the same time. They try and use thermal imaging, thermal ponchos, which hide the thermal signature of the bike and the rider if they're attacking at night. And they do them only, they say they commit them only to missions where they think they're likely to succeed and don't have them out in the open for too long. And they're also using them a lot more for kind of evacuating the wounded and for logistical purposes rather than always just relying on them for assaults. But they do use them for assaults. They have been criticized for taking casualties in this manner as well, and being accepting of casualties when other units are not necessarily willing to do so. So they've tried to adapt them, and they've enjoyed some success, in this area. The counterattack Scala has been pretty key to taking a lot of these villages. They say they're fighting in 7 villages around the Pokrovsk and Dobropilya area, which is a big responsibility. It's a lot of places to be fighting at once. And we saw that happening when we were in their regimental headquarters. We could see them overseeing the battle in different places and how intense the fighting was for these guys.
And as you say, concerns have been raised about the high casualty rate by relatives as well. How bad is it, do you think? And what did the commanders say about that?
So a lot of relatives have said, the lives of our loved ones are being thrown away by this regiment, and they've come out and posted. You do get this posting quite often on lots of different units, but it's particularly prevalent among the Scala regiment. The officers respond to it by saying, look, we're called upon to do very difficult tasks, and we don't necessarily lose more people than a motorized brigade that's holding positions, and at least the guys we lose are being lost for regaining ground. So there's a purpose to what they're doing. We've also spoke to the regimental sergeant major, who said, I'm really keen to avoid losses. I see like losses of my own friends who I've lost in some of these new recruits, and we take really good care of them. And we could see that they did have had some of the people who were recovering from being in forward positions were getting massages. There were available barbershop, dentistry. They had good conditions for their soldiers once they do come back from the front. So they've tried to respond to some of that criticism.
You've written often about how hard the fighting is on the front line. Coming back from this particular trip, did you learn anything new about the close quarters combat fighting?
I think, Amy, it's so important still to have eyes in the air above you. And I think that's what's really, you can see that soldiers who are guided by drone have a much better chance of fighting and staying alive than they do the ones who are just sent over with not really very much guidance, which still happens on a regular basis. You could see the kind of the extent with technology is just growing and growing, the technological importance in this war. I mean, the regimental command center we went to, it was one of the largest I've been to. Absolutely enormous banks of screens everywhere, different fighting being recorded in real time on different screens. The kind of the information that's being uploaded from reconnaissance drones regularly onto this kind of Delta app that we discussed last time, which is kind of mapping positions of the Russians and the Ukrainians. It's really, really key. And I think what's changing at the moment is particularly that you can be spotted so far behind your lines, and in the areas where you think are safe are absolutely not. And where we were in a company command post, which is where we thought would be a relatively safe place to observe the fighting, we were hearing FPV drones in the air above us going over, and it was pretty frequent. It wasn't a one off. It was really, so the range of those drones has extended. It's been more dangerous, and we were very saddened to hear of the death of a French journalist who'd been covering the war at the same time and in the same areas as we were. It's just not very safe to report on anymore.
Very sobering, I'm sure. Did you get any impression about how good the drone air cover is for the Russian soldiers who are trying to make these advances?
Well, I think given that they were giving advice and on they could be heard over the radio doing it, they clearly are doing it sometimes, and it varies unit to unit, and it varies very much on the Ukrainian side as well. Where some units like Scala actually they have someone in the air above a soldier all the time. That's what a backup unit basically guiding, and others are just there's one drone for a platoon that's going forward, or one drone even for the company, or some who even send them out into the dark. That still sadly happens, but it is just such an important part of warfare now that you have somebody in the air looking over you as you go forward.
And must make the drones themselves high value targets too.
Absolutely.
What else have you seen from this recent trip that we haven't been able to read yet, Maxim, that we can look forward to?
So I have a dispatch coming from the southern front, which is, many soldiers say, is the kind of the easier place to be right now, but it's very tough going. It's these guys are Marines, some of them trained in Britain, who are going on amphibious landings on islands on the Dnipro River Delta. They're still very close quarters fighting with the Russians on these islands. Russians are trying to amass forces on these islands in order to kind of threaten the Ukrainian side and maybe mount landings on the Ukrainian side of the river. And the Ukrainians are landing to try and push them off. And is still very intensive fighting there, and some interesting battlefield innovations, which I'll be writing about in that story.
Maxim Tucker, great to speak to you as ever. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.